You're listening to Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing pans and pandas with an emphasis on homeopathy. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Mom and Doc Talk. We are joined today. I'm so excited for this. I'm sure, Jody, you're just like buzzing with excitement here too. We have one of the preeminent researchers in homeopathy who is joining us today to talk about some of her really important research that she's done. And I'm so honored that she's willing to join us. Let me tell you a little bit about her. I don't know how well that she's known in the pandas community, but that's clearly going to change, hopefully today. She is very well known in the homeopathy community, and the work that she's doing is just so vital. So again, so honored. So let me tell you all about Dr. Iris Bell. She is a board certified psychiatrist specializing in holistic and integrative approaches to mental health care. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in biology, earned her MD and PhD from Stanford University, and completed her psychiatry residency at the University of California, San Francisco. Over her decades-long career, Dr. Bell has provided inpatient and outpatient psychiatric care at prestigious institutions such as UCSF, Harvard, and the University of Arizona Colleges of Medicine, as well as clinical and research consultations in the private sector. Her clinical and research work has focused on alternative medicine, particularly environmental medicine and homeopathy. With a PhD in neuro and biobehavioral sciences, Dr. Bell has advanced training in biofeedback for autonomic dysregulation, Biofeedback Certification Institute of America, the interaction between diet and sleep and nutrition, fellow of the American College of Nutrition. She is also licensed as a conventional MD in Arizona and California, and as an MDH in homeopathic and integrated medicine in Arizona. Dr. Bell has published more than 150 peer-reviewed scientific papers and book chapters, many on topics related to homeopathic medicine. Her research interests include applying complex system science concepts to understanding the holistic healing process, as well as the nanoparticle nature of homeopathic medicines. And those last two are the main reasons we brought her here today. And those are what we're going to focus on. Her website is dririsbell.com. We'll put all of the ways that you can get in touch with her in the show notes. So I'm sure you guys can tell now why I'm so excited to have this amazing person joining us for the podcast today. Welcome, Dr. Bell.
Thank you very much.
So tell us a little bit more about yourself beyond your bio, which is obviously quite impressive. But we want to hear more about like you and what brought you to homeopathy and to homeopathy research.
Well, a lot of it started even in college when I was studying biofeedback and beginning to understand a little bit how the body worked. And I was managing to eat horrifically because I was a college student, first time away from home, and dropped my health way down. Got into various issues, which eventually turned out to be mostly food sensitivities, but not ordinary allergies. And that brought me to hunt around for help. And I learned about environmental medicine, and that environmental medicine is a very broad term. There was a real pioneer in that field, Theron Randolph, who understood, and just an amazing observer of human health and disease. And he understood that people had these very striking reactions to foods and environmental chemicals. So I ended up redirecting my life at various points to go into medical school when I had started out wanting to learn more about the brain and behavior in a more general sense. And wanted to do research in environmental medicine. So that's why I went to medical school. But literally my first week, maybe my first day in medical school, I was sitting in the student lounge at lunchtime, and a fellow homeopath, or someone who is now a homeopath, came running in and said, "Oh, you have to hear this, that we're going to have a special lecture from this doctor who graduated Stanford, but went to Greece and studied with one of the leaders in the field of homeopathy, George Vathilkis, who is still one of the master homeopaths." And the person who came to speak with Bill Gray, who's a homeopathic physician,
Mhm.
uh, based in California for many years. When I started to hear him talk, I realized that many of the concepts of health and disease that I understood from Randolph and Randolph's observations of people uh, actually turned out to overlap with the way Vithulcus was teaching homeopaths how the body worked and how to trigger healing,
Mhm.
initiate healing with homeopathy. So I got into that, and it's been a long course ever since. I started to learn about nutrition and um, various other areas as I was pursuing some help for my own health, but
Mhm.
also as I started to get involved more with patient care, I began to very clearly see why a lot of doctors had burned out
Mhm.
and wanted some other kinds of answers in things. Um, One of the things I should mention is some of the more recent breakthroughs on the mechanisms of environmental health problems these days actually involve mast cell activation and all
Yeah.
the associated syndromes. So it's all coming full circle finally
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Neil Nathan. He was a guest on our podcast and we talked all about all the environmental stuff. Maybe we'll put a link
Ah,
to that episode in the show notes
oh, good.
just in case anybody wants to check that out too. But yeah, mast cells are like there's so much of an overlap with mast cell activation and all of the stuff that we deal with pans and pandas. It's just and that's what this is where homeopathy is so vibrant and vital
Yeah,
because everything is so connected and you can't really truly address one thing that is happening in the body without addressing everything at the same
right.
time. And mast cells are a big part of that.
Oh,
Um,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I forgot to mention at the very beginning. So I want to tell anybody who might be listening to this on just an audio platform, we are going to have some visual aids. We will do our best for anybody who does not have access or who is visually impaired to describe what it is that we're showing. But Dr. Bell is going to share some of her slides that she uses when she's presenting about some of her research. So again, we will talk through for anybody who's visually impaired the best that we possibly can. And for anybody who has access to a visual platform or the video option on the various different platforms that we have this episode airing, it might be good to go check those out or come back to it for those particular sections if you wanted to see the visual aid as well.
Dr. Bell, how important is research in homeopathy?
Research, as in any real field of human effort, is critical because we are always trying to understand our health better, our world better, and take advantage of the information we generate with research to improve the human condition in a big sense. It's certainly true for healthcare, medicine, and homeopathy.
Mhm.
So we always talk about some of the challenges that come up with research with homeopathy whenever people ask us about it. And so
Sure.
there's challenges with research in anything. I mean, I know as somebody who has had to participate as a student and then even as a professional participating in some research, that there are different strategies to help produce certain outcomes that some places will use. And then also challenges with like lots of the ways that studies can be set up. There's also specifically with homeopathy, there's the challenge with trying to apply something broadly that needs to be so uniquely and individually recommended. So
Right.
as somebody who lives and breathes research, can you tell us what some of the challenges are with conducting research in homeopathy, just as a preface to this conversation?
Sure. Well, the first very practical one is funding. There have been funding limitations, especially in the United States, but actually in many other countries around the world. And there has one of the underlying issues, which is really how I got interested in how could this thing work, um, because I saw it work, I experienced it working, but how does it do that? Um, One of the main challenges is the skeptical position
Mhm.
that the medicines themselves are diluted so much that there's nothing there. And the only possible explanation has to be a placebo effect. Just basically, it's in your mind that you're being able to improve as much as you can with just a placebo effect. And there's no acceptance of the idea that there might be a science behind homeopathy. That has affected the availability of funding, which has a downstream effect of really limiting the interest of most young researchers coming through the academic world, because their careers will go absolutely nowhere for the most part if they work in homeopathy and try to survive academically in a publish or perish environment. And also a grant getting environment. Behind the scenes, most people have heard of publish or perish, but the way you publish in most fields of medicine requires a lot of funding. And so it's a circular thing of bringing down the access to the ability to even do studies. And then there has been for many years a lack of a sense that there was science we could bring to the whole subject. So that those have been interwoven, interacting kinds of factors. The other thing, which is also very important, first of all, there's very little understanding of homeopathic practice theory outside of homeopathy. People don't understand that you need to individualize treatment, that one size does not fit all, basically. They're beginning to appreciate that in, again, general conventional medicine, and that may give us an opening down the road. But there's been no sense that we should bother. Once you are actually doing the work, you begin to understand there's a lot of what we would call methodological challenges. Now, it's easy to blind it because, yes, the active or verum version of a remedy looks, smells, and tastes exactly like the placebo does. So it's very easy to do that. Whereas if you did something like massage or acupuncture, it gets way more challenging to figure out what's the control condition, because you are touching the patient, you're doing things. And there are unique sensations, particularly in acupuncture, associated with hitting an actual acupuncture point, as opposed to just sticking a needle somewhere in the body. And of course, then the issue with homeopathy is in conventional medicine, there are certain standards for evaluating a research study in medicine. Those are reasonable standards, but they require that you use a one-size-fit-all intervention largely, and compare it with placebo in a blinded condition. The blinding isn't the problem, but knowing for sure, the homeopath knowing for sure that they have a verum remedy that's actually going to help that individual patient, that takes sometimes some trial and error. And eventually, most homeopaths will find their way to an effective homeopathic remedy. But in a research design, you have to say up front, all right, I'm doing this. Now, we have modified that kind of methodology in homeopathy research to say you have to be true to the system that you're testing. And conventional medicine may have one drug for everybody with a conventional diagnosis. Homeopathy could have thousands or at least hundreds of possible remedies to select. And you never know which one it might be for a given patient at a given point in their course of their health and their disease. So those are some of the biggest issues. And it becomes then a challenge to, when you design a study, both meet the requirements of conventional medical research criteria and meet the individualized nature of homeopathy, where you have to find out, is this remedy going to work before you put it into a blinded condition? There are some homeopaths, particularly in Europe and Scandinavia, who have gotten very clever about how to do that. And they've pre-tested things openly, remedies, until they found something that started to make a difference. And then they cleared the person of that remedy and then put them into a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Conventional doctors wouldn't see the point to that, but homeopaths understand it because
Mhm.
you have to treat the individual, and that's what it keeps coming back to.
I would argue that well, maybe not conventional doctors, but pharmaceutical companies see the value in that because they do the placebo washout as well. So like
Sure.
that's one of the things that people don't always necessarily recognize, that the studies that we're reading that show that there's better than placebo response for a lot of conventional medications have already taken out the people who are very clearly placebo responders. So if you
Yeah.
included all the people who were clearly placebo responders, it would be far worse than placebo in many cases.
Right.
So we see that even on the conventional side.
Right. And they also screen out people who are very sick until the drug gets out into the community,
Yeah,
um, because they don't want people to fail their drug trials.
right.
Um,
So there's lots of different ways that
yeah.
research can be manipulated and for specific outcomes to be accomplished. And it's harder to do that with homeopathy just because the nature of the way homeopathy is individually recommended. At least from my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong,
No,
that it's harder to
that's
do.
quite true.
Yeah. There's so many little pieces that, someone like myself who doesn't have,
Mhm.
the education and the knowledge that you guys have, there's so many little pieces that we don't know. So it's very interesting. So with that, Dr. Bell, what should a parent or a healthcare professional know when they're looking at homeopathic research?
They really have to look at the design of the study. There were studies done on homeopathy by people who were skeptics who deliberately didn't individualize. And they said, lo and behold, we've done hundreds of people with this one remedy. It doesn't work. They also didn't have any prior evidence, not even a clue, that the medicine that they were giving was appropriate for the condition they were studying. So they standardized the condition and they
Mm,
standardized the intervention and said, doesn't work. No, it doesn't work like a conventional drug.
right.
That's probably one of the biggest things. And another piece in research, which happened in some of the earlier skeptic studies on homeopathy, was that they would pick people who were already at their ceiling of improvement. They had gotten as far as they could with whatever treatment they had. And then they tried to see what homeopathy will do. Well, many times homeopathy can add a benefit beyond whatever conventional treatment does. But if your outcome measure is something that's already gone, you're not going to see further improvement because there's no room for improvement in those individuals. So there are all sorts of tricks and games that can be played. So evaluating the methods by which a study was designed and conducted are extremely important.
Are there any shortcuts for that? Like if people were to just search the authors, is that like a way that people could have a shortcut for like, moms and dads who are listening to this who don't have any research background, that don't understand, like, was the study designed by a skeptic trying to disprove homeopathy? Or are there
Well,
shortcut clues that we could look for?
the shortcut clues about to do you know who is a skeptic and who is a proponent of a
Mhm.
particular thing? It's part of why we all have to mention our conflicts of interest in our
Mhm.
research papers. Because if you're being paid by a drug company um, to do a study on their product, chances are you're going to try as hard as you can to find something that they
Right,
like.
right.
So that certainly is one basic principle in general. And there's been a real movement in medicine generally to try to cut back on those conflicts of interest, but they're not completely gone from
Mhm.
the playing field at this point.
So for our extra ambitious parents, which in the pandas community, we have a lot of them just because
I'm
it's a
sure.
poorly understood condition that's really complex. So for those extra ambitious parents who are pulling up the research and reading it themselves, where in the research article would they look to see where the conflicts of interest would be listed?
They're typically mentioned either in a footnote or at the very end of an article. Most good reputable journals will require a statement on conflict of interest,
Mhm.
and then you have to make your judgment from there. In a field like this, we often, when I was particularly active in doing studies, we knew which authors were more likely to be the skeptics publishing,
Mhm.
because even doing a negative study on homeopathy by a skeptic, that takes resources and so on.
Yeah.
So there weren't that many research groups even looking into things.
Mhm.
So those are some of the things you can look at. It's never simple to really sort that out.
One thing I'm going to recommend, and I don't know for sure if it's accessible as a standalone presentation, but Dr. Elizabeth Rice did a presentation at the Joint American Homeopathic Council or conference earlier this year on how to effectively read a research study.
Mm,
And so I think that it was really, really useful because she talked about different things like places that you could look first, if like reading it out of order can actually help bring clarity to
Mhm.
how reliable the information is going to be and how
mhm.
reliable the results are likely to be. So we can look for that, and I'll see if we can find a way that you can actually access it is an individual thing. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. If it's not there, we weren't able to find it, or it's not accessible as
Right.
an individual thing.
Well,
Uh,
that's a very important thing generally, because you have to see, are they building their plan for this new study that they're now reporting on the shoulders of previous work?
mhm,
Have they thoroughly looked at what has been raised as some of the things that I mentioned already today,
mhm,
uh, but other issues in that particular question that they're studying, and have they paid attention to it? Are they using standardized scales or outcome measures? Do they have objective measures?
mhm,
In some of our earlier studies, we literally used EEG or brain waves
mhm,
as a more objective measure of what the homeopathic remedy was doing. But then, we had them sniffing the bottle that had the
mhm,
verum and placebo. So we controlled for the effect of just sniffing something that isn't active.
mhm.
Um, and you have to do that. So you have to look very carefully at how it was done.
Yeah.
And did they have enough people in the study?
Yeah.
Many homeopathy studies, because they're underfunded, don't
There's
have thousands of people in them. Most of them will have, if we're lucky, 100 people in them.
mhm,
And that means the effect of the treatment has to be even larger to be able to detect it in a small sample of people,
yeah.
when what you're going to end up doing is averaging the outcome.
Mhm,
Even if you could point to an individual and say, that was not a placebo effect, that's amazing.
mhm.
But in a research study, it often comes down to averages of everybody who got the verum versus everybody who got the placebo.
Right. All right, so let's go ahead and without further ado, let's dive into some of the specifics of your research. The ones that you shared in your bio are the ones that we are most interested in talking about today. So the
Sure.
ones about the presence of nanoparticles in the ultra dilute potentized medicines. Let's start there.
What I got interested in when I was funded by the National Institutes of Health for a little while, looking more at brainwaves in waking and sleep in human subjects with homeopathic medicines. And I also did what would be called a preliminary or pilot study with a small sample of about 60 people in patients with fibromyalgia, double-blind, placebo-controlled, that was positive. I was applying to NIH for follow-up funding to do a larger study on more people. And they basically said to me, we don't care whether you have the most amazing clinical result. We don't believe it because we don't believe there's a plausible mechanism. go away and figure out how this thing works, and then come back.
Mhm.
So many years ago, I went away, and it was very frustrating because I didn't have the funding. But I proceeded to try to look more at where the science where regular advances in conventional research science could intersect with homeopathy and how we understand the human body to heal. And I discovered first that there's a whole area of research on what would be called complex adaptive systems. That's living systems, which are, yes, they're complicated, but they're complex because the parts interact with one another and they're interdependent. I mean, your brain really needs the rest of your body. You can't just stick a brain on a table
Right.
and have it do something, and vice versa for all the other body parts. So they all interact. And that's really the way homeopaths look at the body.
Mhm.
Because one of the things, one of the ways we often look at conventional drug treatments is that they can suppress symptoms in a particular organ, but that doesn't mean they've suppressed the disease process.
Right.
They've simply prevented it from expressing itself on that body part. And then it'll move somewhere else, oftentimes to a more important organ. So there's a whole concept of don't necessarily treat your skin rash with a steroid and expect that you won't be at risk of something even less desirable going on in your body later on.
Yeah.
So with all of that in mind, I discovered the notion that complex adaptive systems could be a way of understanding how we get sick and how we can heal, and how conventional medicine suppresses the body's ability to express symptoms in the least important organ it can manage to do that. So I understood that, and I was writing a number of papers on that. And then around 2010, there was a new paper that came out in the journal Homeopathy, where a research group in India who were specialists in nanotechnology had started to report that they were seeing nanoparticles of the original source material in homeopathically prepared medicines that weren't in placebo, basically.
Mhm.
They pursued that in several different ways to try to explain things to people, but they didn't fully grasp, okay, there are nanoparticles there, but you don't have a flood of nanoparticles. And I've run into this objection too. Well, you don't have that many nanoparticles. Well, you do. Now, nanoparticles are something like a billionth of a nanometer in size. They're a tiny fraction of a human hair diameter.
Mhm.
And that is where the action is in terms of homeopathy, because of the way homeopathic medicines are manufactured. So when I heard about the nanoparticle findings, I suddenly saw the connection between the complex systems. I thought, well, if we give nanoparticles and the body is made up of signaling networks, which another group in India had begun to emphasize a few years after that, then homeopathy is probably basically modulating how the networks of the body actually function. So it affects function much more than structure. I mean, even if you use homeopathy for a broken bone, it's going to be affecting the way the body makes new bone to heal the fracture. It's
Right.
not going to set the bone the way a conventional surgeon could do.
Right.
Um, but homeopathy is very good at affecting function. And so that was where my thinking shifted. And I began to think of, well, how would we understand nanoparticles? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, and let me just show a slide. I'm not sure whether I am showing my slide.
Yes, we can see your slide. We see one that says Adaptive Network
Good.
Nanomedicine, How Homeopathy Works.
Well, this is the whole story of what I've put together, although there are many details in other slides I have. But basically, in homeopathy, when from the time of Hahnemann, who founded this field literally centuries ago at this point, more than 2 centuries, they ground up the source material. Or say they had a plant, they would take an herbal extract of that plant, a tincture, a concentrate, and they would serially dilute it. Well, everybody who is a skeptic was focusing in on the dilution, but they paid no attention to the fact that they ground these things up. Well, it turns out that in modern nanoscience, discovered centuries later from Hahnemann's time, mechanical grinding is one of the ways you make a nanoparticle. He had a cruder thing because he had a mortar and pestle and he was just grinding away, put it in some milk sugar and just ground until he got tiny, tiny particles. He realized he was getting very small material. He didn't know that there were nanoparticles, and the kind of microscopes they had couldn't even see them. You need an electron microscope to see them. And the other thing is, only recently, people have begun to look at herbal extracts as a natural biological way of making nanoparticles in conventional nanomedicine. And part of that has been motivated by the fact that other than the mechanical grinding, naturally, the general nanoscience world moved into chemicals and started producing fairly toxic, or at least materials that were nanoparticles, but were contaminated with toxic chemicals. And they realized if they wanted to use these for medicine applications, they needed a safer form.
Yeah.
So they looked at the herbal forms and discovered that the herbal extracts, plant extracts, can actually biologically generate nanoparticles basically in their own image. You know, plants have a lot of elements in them, among them silicon, and you can actually construct structures of silica with plant extracts that the plant uses itself as a template of how it's going to assemble this material. So you end up with a very unique nanoparticle with 2 different ways of doing it, one mechanical, one botanical, and chemical free. I mean, synthetic chemical free.
Yeah.
And you end up with these nanoparticles in both ways. Once you do that, now you have what amounts to low doses of nanoparticles. Now, in homeopathy manufacturing, once we have these initial materials, we do serial dilutions in alcohol, water, solvent, basically. And the dilution is not just diluted. It is actually shaken very vigorously. It's called succussion in homeopathy. That vigorous shaking is, again, somewhat equivalent to the modern use of various mechanical things that modern scientists have available that agitate things that are in solution. So I went into the mainstream literature and discovered, oh, in nanotechnology, they've discovered they make nanoparticles when they agitate things that are in solution. They also discovered that if they agitate things in glassware, which is what Hahnemann originally used, they actually knock silica and silicon, basically break it down by the shaking. They knock that off the wall, the inner wall of the container. And so you have the precursor of silica that a plant extract, for example, could start assembling in its own image. When you get those nanoparticles, even beyond that, the material from the original source gloms on, the technical term is adsorb, but it gloms onto the outer surface of the nanoparticle, which is extraordinarily reactive because of its tiny size. Once things glom on, now you have a very interesting active material, which is more biologically potent. And that is the case. The smaller the nanoparticle, often the more potent it is. And in homeopathy, there is research showing that that you get smaller and smaller sized nanoparticles as you go up in homeopathic potency. So you're ending up with something that's capable of talking to the body. But what happens from there? Well, then you go back to my model here, that the body talks, it communicates. The relationships that I mentioned of one body part to another are brought about by the fact that there are networks, biochemical networks, physical, structural networks, but the body is organized into networks. And if you tap into a good place in that network, you're going to modify the whole network, and you're going to have a big downstream effect that's going to get bigger and bigger because you're doing it in a complex adaptive system which amplifies small effects and makes them large. So that's, we're up here in terms of the body as a whole system responding, because if you make a change in one body part, the signal is going to go out through the rest of the system. And as things change in one network or sub-network, they're going to change in more places. And if you're triggering a healing response, you're very likely to have the evolution of recovery, basically, that is going to take time because the body has to reorganize itself. A property, an established property of complex adaptive systems is that they adapt. If something changes in its environment, internal or external, it makes adjustments to deal with that the best it can. And I wanted to maybe show another slide here.
And for anybody who's on audio only right now, just so you know, everything that is printed on the screen has been said by Dr. Bell. So you're not missing anything. You're just missing the visual of what she's saying.
Now, I found some health departments, food banks that had good diagrams here, because what they emphasize is that we have a relative contribution to our health that comes certainly from genetics and certainly from the environment. And that could be psychological, chemical, or physical. But a lot of it comes from what we eat, what we do to ourselves, you know, how we behave in terms of better or worse health behaviors. All those things contribute to our health. And the environment is capable of turning on different patterns of genetic response.
Yeah.
So we end up with the physical, chemical, and biological environment affecting life processes and systems. Well, what if you intervene with homeopathy, giving it what amounts to a signal that may be somewhat chemical and physical and somewhat biological in nature, that is recognized by the body as, oh, this is relevant to me. Well, it turns out not only that the plant material can absorb onto the outside of a nanoparticle, it turns out the second that you put a nanoparticle into a human body, either whether it comes in contact with saliva or blood, and you'll recognize that's the way we give remedies, the biological proteins that that person has glom onto the outside of the nanoparticle. And that nanoparticle acquires what the experts in the nanoscience world call a biological identity. So maybe you gave a calcium carbonate nanoparticle, a homeopathic remedy, calcarea carbonicum, but if it's the right remedy for that person, it is likely to be attracting onto its surface. And this is one of the areas we need confirmatory research. But the proteins that it's going to attract are going to be representative of the disease state or health state of that individual person. And so the individualization may come from the interaction of a similar bit of information coming from the nanoparticle, you might call it the raw nanoparticle, interacting with the body. And once it does, you're ending up with a unique biological signal that is that person's disease attached via the adsorption process onto the outside of these nanoparticles, and quite capable of signaling all of the biological networks in the body to make some changes. And it's giving it in a low dose,
Right.
which is critical from another perspective.
So before we move on, I just want to share for anybody who, again, is visually impaired, the images that we're seeing here is an overlap of Venn diagram of the physical environment, chemical environment, and biological environment. And the centerpiece of the overlap is life processes and systems. And then the other image is showing that 50% of health is healthy behavior, 20% is environment, 20% is genetics, and 10% is access to care.
Great, thank you. Okay. So I've been saying, okay, it's a complex adaptive system. What does that mean? If something changes from the external environment or actually the internal environment, the body adapts. And this is a diagram I'm showing here just of the fact that there is an interaction between the various body parts, biochemical networks, and so on, which sends their information and their changes up to what it would be called the emergent organism, the whole person, the person as a whole, and vice versa. It goes, the information also travels downward. So as there are changes, there are going to be adjustments all over the system. And I just want to move on to the next slide, because this is really the critical issue when we talk about, okay, there are nanoparticles, okay, there's a complex system, so what? Well, the world amounts to stress, in case no one's noticed. There's a lot of that going around.
Yep.
And any change in the environment, in one sense, could be understood as a stress or a stressor. It affects a cell to one extent or another. If it's an overwhelming stressor, the cell will die or the organism will die. But if it's a mild stressor, which is essentially what homeopathy is, it will make adjustments because it's an adaptive system that you're sending that stressor into. It's going to make adjustments. And what's it going to adjust to? It's going to increase its ability to resist a higher level, a more toxic amount of that stressor. Well, what if you've represented the person's disease process in the homeopathic nanoparticle with the person's physiologic state proteins all glommed onto the outside of that nanoparticle as a tiny signal to say, this is bad. We better do something. We better make some adaptive changes. And the result, if the cell or the person doesn't die, is survival. You get an increase in the ability of the cell to resist that stressor in the future, i.e. the disease process. And in fact, you get something that would be considered increased cross resistance. So, at a more physical level, you could adapt someone to cold stress, but they might be able to tolerate some other kind of physical stress or a little bit better because they also had adapted to cold stress. There are things like that to understand. And homeopathy basically would be serving as this mild signal that could trigger the adaptive changes that improve resistance to the disease process over time. Well, a completely separate area of research, which has had its own controversies because it got lumped in with homeopathy, unfortunately, years ago. And it's still emerged scientifically as having so much scientific evidence supporting it that now much broader acceptance that it happens. The process of adaptation is called hormesis.
Mhm.
That just happens to be the term that was given to it. And it's the idea of a physiological process by which the living system makes adaptive change. And it turns out that the diagram of hormesis runs pretty much like this. Give too much of the stressor and you cause harm. But if you start giving a small enough amount of the stressor, you actually can cause benefit. And this has been shown over and over, literally with drugs that are used for chemotherapy to kill cancer cells, pesticides, and all sorts of things, including psychological stress. There's a Yerkes-Dotson law, I believe, even years ago. I think my father told me to remember that. And I thought, I don't know what that's about, but I read about it when I started to read about overlapping concepts in this field of hormesis, that there is an ideal amount of stress or anxiety. There actually has been research in psychology where just the right amount of anxiety was the best.
It's vital. Yeah. A
Yeah,
certain amount is vital for us to actually do anything.
yeah. And I think they did some research even with people doing parachute jumping out of airplanes. And you need just the right amount of anxiety, but you need a parachute, and you need to know what you're doing with it. And it turns out that even with just psychological stress, there's an ideal amount that prepares you and stress and it prepares you for that stress and helps you resist the bad effects and actually get through it much better. And all of us know if you're into a panic attack, you've gone too far. So you have to have just the right amount. And that's where we are talking about hormesis. And this is just a more wordy definition of it, but it's basically the ability of biological systems and networks to adapt by making changes across their networks.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show you this. The cells function by communicating both within a cell and between cells. In fact, cells communicate with one another. How do they do it? They use nanostructures to do it.
Yeah.
They use little bits of vesicle that include some of the inner parts of the cellular fluid, the cytoplasm, with DNA and lipids and proteins. And they package it up in a little kind of membrane inclusion at the nanoscale level, the billionth of whatever. And they send that thing out over to other cells to say, hey, this is what's going on for me. Here's the information about what's going on. And literally, that is the way the body communicates with itself.
And this is just an image that's showing that visual representation of what you're describing.
Yeah. And there are, I would imagine, thousands of biochemical networks all interacting. There are different kinds of signaling pathways. They involve different biochemicals talking to each other and talking to the cells and causing the information to be traveling across the living system. So what it amounted to in all of this is my overall research approach was to think, well, what kinds of principles do we have in homeopathy? And how does that overlap or speak to, or how is it spoken to by mainstream scientific research that may not be what conventional medicine uses to do its work, but which is much more relevant to what's going on with homeopathy and how it can help. So I wanted to just show you one more slide. And this is a quote from Hahnemann's basic medical textbook that he wrote a long time ago. And basically what he said was the initial action of a product of both medicinal is a product of both medicinal energy and the life force. And it belongs more to the impinging potency of the medicine. Our life force strives to oppose this impinging action with its own energy. This back action belongs to our sustentive power of life and is an automatic function of it. And he called it the after action or counteraction. That sounds a whole lot like hormesis. That sounds a whole lot like adaptive change. And so, there are many slides I could show, but I know we have limited time and I want to give you time for other questions. But that, in a nutshell, captures my current working model for how things go. And it can foster hypothesis-driven research. This isn't necessarily something we just cook up out of thin air and say, well, that's how it works. We ought to be able to demonstrate it. Yeah. And one of the things, let me see if I can find a slide that shows it.
Well, while you're looking for that, I want to share with you a couple of things. So what you just described, we have an episode just like 2 episodes back where we talk about primary and secondary actions, which is basically what you just read to us from the Organon of Medicine. And so that's essentially what you're describing. So I love how when you talk about the stressors that we're presenting to the body, being connected to the body itself. And so you said, the stressor of the total, or I interpret it like where, some people might think of things like isopathy, where we're giving the stressor to strep to reduce susceptibility to strep specifically. But when we use homeopathy, we're using the stressor of the totality of the disease, not one specific thing. And that's what you were talking about, or that's how I interpreted what you were saying about the nanoparticle and the interaction between the nanoparticle and the proteins of the body being representative of the disease itself.
Right.
And so, and that's where we get the primary action of the medicine and the secondary action of the body pushing back against the medicine. And that's where the healing comes, is the secondary action or that counteraction that you just, in your particular quote.
And in conventional medicine, you see it most clearly with conventional drugs that are addictive, in the sense that if you take the addictive drug away, the body has a rebound.
We talk about that a lot in this
and it has a rebound of the symptoms that were being basically held back by the drug.
And they're often worse. Yeah.
In homeopathy, we're deliberately trying to get the rebound because we've titrated a very low dose of the stressor, not to bang it over the head, but to encourage it to make positive change.
Yeah.
So I don't have the slide specifically, but before I talk about this last one, I did do a study using sleep and analyzed the complexity of the brainwaves during sleep. And we found that when people got a homeopathic remedy, these were people with a history of coffee-induced insomnia. And they received either a remedy called coffea cruda, which is homeopathically prepared coffee, basically, or nux vomica, which is a common homeopathic remedy used for people who have drug issues, but also it is used for insomnia, people with insomnia. And we gave them a dose of it. It was controlled by placebo and blinded and all that. And we recorded their sleep at night. We found that the night that they got the Verum homeopathic medicine, whichever one it was, because they were randomized to get one or the other, that compared with their baseline night and their placebo night, the homeopathy actually initially slightly suppressed the sleep pattern, the complexity of that sleep pattern. And the next day, there was a rebound effect in the opposite direction, which was much more positive in terms of what it did for sleep.
So you actually had visual representation on EEG of that primary action and then the secondary response from the body. That's
right.
Great.
And in this slide that I am showing now, This was done by the same group in India that originally demonstrated electron microscope pictures of nanoparticles. They took those same nanoparticles and tested them in a biological medium where they could measure what the cell was doing, the metabolism of the cell. And this is one of several studies that were in vitro. I mean, we're not talking about some person believing that there's a placebo working. This is a bunch of cells doing their metabolic thing. And what you see is at different concentrations of different potencies of homeopathy, you can see this hormetic effect documented. So, and this has been done by a completely independent group using formaldehyde in cells, in bacterial cells also. The idea that the lower dose of the homeopathically prepared material could actually stimulate an increase in this metabolic activity, whereas if you got to higher concentrations, you suppressed it, you killed it, basically. And these are just two, this was silver, metal, and tin, I guess, that were studied where they demonstrated the nanoparticles there, and then they demonstrated that those nanoparticles did in fact produce hormesis.
Yeah.
So we're talking about replicated findings, which is another thing that scientists always hope to see.
Yes.
And it's sometimes hard in homeopathy because we have individual states we're in. Not only do you have individual people, but we're different now than we were an hour ago.
Right.
And so you have to go with the state of the person at that moment in time, or the state of the cell.
Yeah.
And
So even a
looking at
remedy
what
that
the
worked for
effect
somebody
is.
3 days ago won't necessarily work for them today.
Right. Because
Yeah.
they're in a different state now.
Yeah. So you can even repeat the same study on the same person and have different outcomes because of what remedy is actually appropriate at that time.
Right.
Well, Dr. Bell, we do need to wrap up here shortly. And I
Sure.
know that Jody's going to want to ask a question that I'm sure all moms are thinking after listening to your amazing presentation. I want to just share with you how valuable I find your research to be. So as somebody, I don't know how much you know about my history, but I almost quit naturopathic medical school because homeopathy was a required part of the curriculum. And when it was introduced to me, I thought it was complete and utter nonsense. And I was in school when these studies came out that showed that there were nanoparticles. So my background before I even went to naturopathic medical school, my undergrad was in physiology and neurobiology. And I was in the military and worked as a defense contractor, as an Arabic linguist for, before I went to medical school. So my brain was not set up to understand that you're giving somebody nothing. And that there's still something that's going to happen. So like I said, I almost quit naturopathic medical school. Fortunately, I had my own, much like you, reason to explore homeopathy for my own health, which gave me the willingness to accept that even though I couldn't explain it, I could understand that it worked and understand the value of learning how to use it effectively. So the left side of my brain that, my undergraduate training was so relieved to see some of the research that you have done, and it helps make sense for me. And I always tell people that by the time hopefully that I am ready to retire, we will fully understand. And that's my hope, that we will fully understand how homeopathy works. And at the same time, I think it's vital that we remember that all of the things, you're basically just validating things that Samuel Hahnemann understood from experience over 200 years ago. Because even when you were talking about, the succussion and the trituration, or the stirring, the mixing, the grinding, creating nanoparticles, I remember learning back when I didn't think homeopathy was a legitimate form of medicine. I remember learning that Hahnemann himself found that if you didn't do the trituration or that grinding or the succussion, that it didn't work. So he didn't know that it was nanoparticles that were being formed, but he knew if you didn't do the process that we now understand makes nanoparticles, it didn't work. So all we're really doing with all of the research is essentially validating something that we know through experience and the scientific method, the application of the scientific method, that we know that it works. That said, there's a lot of people that alone is not good enough for. So I'm so grateful for the research that you're doing and helping us explain how it works.
Well, thank you. And there's so much more to do.
Yeah, as you were talking earlier, I was thinking, oh my goodness, if Jody that had just started homeopathy was sitting here listening to you talk, I would have been so confused. And so I want to say to any moms or dads listening,
Sure.
if this is confusing, it's okay. I understand what y'all are talking about because I've been through this process and I've seen the primary and the secondary, and so I understand a little bit of that. I think also my gratitude is for the fact that we have brilliant doctors like yourself that are doing this work to answer the questions that we as parents have. And so somebody else is worrying about the research and doing the research and the hard work to answer all the questions that everyone has, especially the hard questions. So as far as parents like myself, because there's over the past, I've been around for 6 years, kind of in this homeopathy world, there's just more and more and more families that are going through this journey and healing their kids. And they're like, yes, but we still have, it's hard to talk about homeopathy. It's hard to teach people about
Yes.
homeopathy. There's so many questions, safety and research being one of them. We want to help and we want to do our part spreading, the word about homeopathy and how it can help everybody, not just Pan's kids. So what specifically can we do to support homeopathy research? How can
That
we
is
get behind you?
sure. It's a hard question and an easy one.
Mhm.
As research pops up, literally helping contribute as volunteers in different ways, both to participate in research, but also to donate to people who are trying to do self-funded work, which unfortunately in homeopathy is the way a lot of things get done. There are some private foundations that do fund homeopathic research, and they don't hold a candle, at least now, to the funding that NIH could have provided but doesn't, and putting consumer pressure on NIH to take a fresh look at the work that's out there internationally, because there's a lot of progress that's been made in Europe and Scandinavia and Latin America in research on homeopathy, and certainly in India, which has really emerged as one of the leaders. And the scientists they're behind the times if they don't see that. So finding information that you can share with the skeptical doctors around to explain to them why this is important. There's even research on the safety of homeopathy. So if they have questions about that, there's a lot of ways of trying to address that by itself. So even if they shrug and say, well, it couldn't hurt because there's nothing there, at least they're willing to let you proceed and get the help that may make such a huge difference.
Well, thank you so much for all of the work that you do and for taking the time to join us. As Jody said, I'm sure people that this was like way beyond what they're able to understand right now. And there are lots of opportunities to learn more about it. If you've got questions, you can always reach out to us. We will do our best to clarify if there's any particular topics. We can always have another podcast to explain smaller pieces of this really big picture. Like right now, we were really just wanting to discuss like the big picture overview of like the research that Dr. Bell is doing. So feel free to reach out to us. The way to contact us is always in the show notes. And for those of you who are just loving this and eating it up, definitely check out Dr. Bell's website. Will be linked in the show notes. There's links to all of her research that you can find on PubMed through her website. And I believe, do you have any of your videos? Because I know you've got some videos that even show some really great images of what happens on when like the nanoparticles bind at the cellular level.
Not yet, but
Okay.
that will be an update that I'll be doing hopefully before this actually gets played.
Okay, so hopefully you guys will be able to see these amazing videos that I've seen at some of Dr. Bell's presentations in the past. Hopefully those will be available on her website very, very soon. So again, thank you, Dr. Bell, for the work that you have done. Thank you for your generosity and time and coming to share your work with our community.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Okay, thanks.
We hope you found this episode helpful, hopeful, and inspiring. We try to get a new episode out every week. You can make sure you don't miss any by following us on Spotify or subscribing to our channel on YouTube. If you want to connect with us more, join our Facebook group, Homeopathy for Pans and Pandas, where we have exclusive weekly videos and answer your questions about, you guessed it, homeopathy for pans and pandas throughout the week. If you are already a member, give us a shout out and let us know what you thought about this episode. If you aren't on Facebook and would like to reach us, you can email us at podcast@resiliencenaturopathic.com. Until next time, take care and remember, this won't be forever.